Hey, what's going on, guys? Jason here, and thanks for stopping by the shop today. So in this video, we're going to change gears again, and we're going to go ahead and do a shop talk. Now, today's subject is actually going to be something that was asked about in one of the comments from one of my other videos, and that is spring over and spring under suspensions. All right, so I'm going to be really careful not to say spring over versus spring under, because both are good suspensions. Set up properly, they both have advantages. So we're going to go ahead and go through some of the differences between the two. We're going to go through some of the costs associated with each one. We're going to go through the simplicity of each one and which one might be right for your Jeep. So go ahead, grab yourself a bottle of studs and hang out. Alright, what a pain that was. Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back. So, as promised, we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the differences between a spring over and spring under leaf suspension. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is components required. Okay, now this is a little bit controversial. We're going to go ahead and just talk about a regular 4-inch suspension lift. Let's just go 4 inches. That's a real easy number. It's a real common lift. So we'll start there. Let's go ahead and go over the spring under first. If you've been watching the show for a while, you'll know that my kit is actually a 4-inch lift kit. It's from Rusty's Off-Road, and I can describe to you the components that came in it. Now, we had to extend the brake lines because, of course, you're dropping that axle down away from the frame because your spring has a larger arch. So you're going to need extended brake lines. You're going to need longer shocks. Another thing that you're going to need to do is you're going to need to change the angle of the pinion. Usually these come with degree shims that allow you to rotate that pinion upward. When a pinion is driven and the pinion is below center line, it tends to rotate upwards when you hit the throttle, when pressure is applied, rather. So that being said, you got to get it a little bit closer, because if you're too far negative on that pinion, you're just going to create a lot of drive line vibrations. So we've got extended brake lines, we've got longer shocks, we've got degree shims, we've got a stiffer leaf pack. Now this leaf pack itself comes with more leaves in it now. With you creating a larger arch, you need to add that rigidity. It's just going to keep a lot of things in check and keep a lot of things from bouncing around too much. Because you are ending up with, in effect, a bigger spring, you just want to make sure all that stuff's controlled a little bit easier. This kit came with everything I needed. It was very simple to bolt on. One thing that I'm going to add here is at 4 inches, you probably need to go ahead and throw a slip yoke eliminator on the back of the transfer case. Now, what happens here is at about 4 inches, you start running out of slip on your drive shaft itself. And honestly, what that can lead to is suspension binding, or even worse, you can start snapping the pinion off. You can snap it off on the transfer case side, you can snap the drive shaft on the pinion side of the axle. There's just a lot of stuff at play. So my recommendation, even though it didn't come with this kit, is going to be at like 3 inches or above. You probably need to go ahead and do a slip yoke eliminator. So now let's go ahead and talk about a spring over conversion. Now, generally speaking, if you use a stock spring and go spring over, you're going to end up with axle tube plus spring perch, which is usually right at 4 inches, maybe a little bit more, give or take. So with a stock spring and going spring over, you've got pretty much 4 inches of lift right off the bat. Now, companies do sell higher spring perches, so you can get a little bit more lift there. If you got to go that way and you need a little bit more lift, it's all right to do it that way. You can get an elevated perch. You can also get, well, look, You don't want to do a block. Okay, if you're doing a spring over, I know a lot of heavy duty trucks will do a lift block, but a Jeep's a little bit different. Now the reason I say this is if you're doing it with a stock spring, that spring is generally pretty flat in profile. What happens if you use a flat spring is it's very pliable. You get a lot of compression and a lot of droop. So your axle goes both ways and articulates extremely well. Probably for a rock crawler, that is the way to go. However, that soft pliable spring also has its drawbacks, and a lot of that has to do with axle wrap. Now if you just do a Google search, you will find several companies make an anti-wrap bar for this reason. So this isn't something that I'm making up. This is something that actually happens. When that pinion rotates upward, the forces on it are completely different because the axle is below the spring and because the spring used, pardon me, is often of a flatter profile and it's more pliable. Now if you use a little bit of a lift spring that's got a couple leaves and it's a little bit thicker, it's not going to be as noticeable, but you're still playing with different forces than on a spring under. So you want to make sure you go ahead and put an anti-wrap device on there. So a spring under versus a spring over is night and day. A spring over, you're definitely going to need an anti-wrap bar. It's just safe, it prevents stuff from breaking, but with that being said, all that nice articulation that you get, it's going to bind. Now here's why. A lot of people say these anti-wrap bars aren't going to bind. Now if it's a single bar, it's not going to bind as much. But here's the deal. When an axle goes through its motion on a leaf spring, the axle housing itself rotates up and down. If that traction bar grips on two different sides, then it's going to bind somewhere. So that articulation that you get is often negated by the fact that you have to run a traction bar, or you should run a traction bar. The best way to get around that would probably be to make a removable one if necessary. If you really need that type of articulation for off-road, then you're probably not going to be driving the Jeep too much on the streets. And if you do, God bless you. It's just, you know, with the stock spring and it being as bouncy and as pliable as it is, I personally wouldn't trust it. But several people, you know, are sitting there saying right now, I run mine and it's absolutely fine. That's cool. I'm with you. I've seen a lot of people do it. No problems at all. It's just not my personal preference. So, for a spring over, you're going to need a traction device. Once again, you're going to need longer shocks. That just, you know, goes with the territory. You're going to need your extended brake lines still. And you're also going to need a slip yoke eliminator right off the bat, because almost any spring over swap, you're at 4 inches lift right off the bat, and that's usually past beyond the slip of the drive shaft, and you're going to start breaking stuff. It's not a if, it's a when. So be smart, go ahead, get your traction device, get your slip yoke eliminator, and make stuff happen. Okay guys, so now let's go ahead and talk about the front axles and the components that you're going to need with them. First we're going to go ahead and talk about a conventional suspension. With our 4-inch lift kit, once again, we need some components to make it work. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to get extendable brake lines or brackets that actually drop the brake lines down and where they clip onto the frame at. There are different considerations that have to be made for the front axle. Now on a spring under setup, you're generally going to end up with a drop pitman arm and something to relocate the track bar upward. Now if you don't want to run your track bar and you got a spring under suspension, hey, that's fine. A lot of people don't like them. I think it cuts out on the vague steering feel. But if you are running a spring over axle and you don't want to mess with the track bar, you're making a mistake. With the spring under kit and the track bar, you have a lot of things that are holding the axle in place. So really you're just going to need your additional springs, you're going to need a drop pitman arm, you're going to need a track bar relocation bracket, you're going to need, of course, longer shocks and something to move the brake lines down. It's very simple to do a spring underlift with these. Once again, it's just arch springs. You're not really messing with the geometry of the steering, or correction, you are changing the geometry of the steering, but it's easily correctable. You're not going to run into any long-term problems with the steering, simply because everything is correctable very easily. In the end, you just want to make sure that your track bar and your steering linkage run parallel to each other, and that gap maintains. So steering for a spring under axle, super easy. Now getting into the spring over conversion, once again you're netting 4 inches of lift plus right off the bat. So you're going to need some components up there. When you're doing a spring over axle kit, there are kind of 2 different ways that you can really go about fixing stuff. You can run a drop pitman arm, which will go ahead and correct the steering some, but you're still going to be stretched out quite a bit. And then there's also kits that you can physically bolt onto the knuckles, or if you're switching to full width, you can kind of do a high steer conversion on some full width axles. That's completely possible, but you're bolting something to the knuckle to actually raise the steering points on the knuckle back up, to prevent any kind of bind or any kind of contact with the leaf springs themselves. You are switching the steering to over the axle again. So by putting the axle underneath the spring, you're going to have some stuff to sort out for sure. Once again, I absolutely recommend using a track bar, especially for a spring over axle setup, because you're going to see a lot more bump steer generally, because you're using a softer spring to accomplish that, especially if you're using a stock spring. So that's going to go ahead and toss your steering all over the place even more. Now if you're just crawling, you'll notice that it can actually pop the steering wheel out of your hand or force your steering wheel to move. Really bad if you got standard steering, but if you got power steering, it's not as bad. You have a little bit of fluid there to kind of soften the blow of that, or you have a little bit of mechanical advantage with the power steering. But there's still a lot of force against your steering linkage from the fact that you have softer springs and they are now over top of the axle. So for a spring over axle kit, my list at a minimum is shocks. You absolutely need those. You either need a drop pitman arm or a high steer conversion of some sort. Like I said, they make them to bolt to the knuckles, or you can just run some kind of homemade fab steering. Most spring over axle kits don't include that. Some spring over axle kits include what's called anti-wrap spring perch, which just means it's longer in length and provides more of a surface that's mounted to the actual leaf spring itself, so it's kind of like a longer lever. It's harder for it to twist. Some people believe in those. I don't think that they work at all. So shocks, brake lines, steering linkage, track bar, you're still going to need all that, but it's going to be a much greater degree of difficulty getting everything right. That being said, there's companies out there that specialize in that. If you want that softer ride of those softer springs, you're going to deal with some of the effects of it in the long run. So use your own judgment. If it's going to be mostly a play toy, by all means do what you got to do. But if you're going to be on the street, just remember this: if you have a component that is supposed to be on your suspension and you removed it, and you get into a major accident because of a steering failure, think about what that can come back on you and do. Especially if you're in a state where they say you can't modify your suspension, or only suspension modifications you can do, or certain things. Just use your head, Be smart about it. Don't do something that's dangerous. If you do something and you feel like it's going to be dangerous, then hey, just stop, change your plans, or find a way around it. So that in a nutshell is components needed for the front axle. Spring under, very simple, very minimal adjustments got to be made. Spring over is a little bit more intensive. A lot more steering stuff has to be done. So create your own adventure. Doing a spring over axle requires far more money. To properly do a spring over axle conversion kit, you're buying spring purchase for the rear, you know, all kinds of stuff. So if you end up cutting it down cost for cost, you're probably going to spend about twice as much doing a spring over axle lift as a spring under axle lift. And that's to include the fact that you're probably going to use standard springs. If you're just using stock springs, then you're still going to run into more cost doing that than you are doing the spring under axle setup. And like I said, a lot of that has to do with just the ancillary stuff that you have to buy. Most kits don't offer everything that you need for a spring over axle setup. I haven't seen any spring over comprehensive kits that include all of the components needed for the front axle to correct the steering geometry. I've seen a lot of that stuff added separately, as far as the extended brake lines, anti-wrap, spring perches, and stuff like that. But you know, that being said, I'm sure I'm going to be proven wrong. There's probably somebody out there that does make an entire spring over axle setup, front to rear, top to bottom, that does everything that you want. But I still feel like it's going to come as a premium when you add in safety devices like a rear traction bar and the over the knuckle stuff. You're probably looking at the same, if not more cost. Not to mention the fact that you're sitting at 4+ inches right off the bat, and you're definitely going to need a slip yoke eliminator too. So go ahead and figure double the cost of a spring under axle setup to do a spring over axle setup, and you'll be safe and in the ballpark doing it right. Alright guys, so in summary, really the suspension lift that you choose for your Jeep, it's all up to you. Both of them can work right. You just got to make sure that you pay attention to details, do the safe thing, do the right thing, and make sure that you buy high quality components. If you're going to manufacture it yourself, make sure once again you pay attention to detail. In my opinion, a spring over is a good suspension, but it's got its limited uses, whereas to me a spring under is great for everything. You don't get as much articulation out of a spring under setup. You get far more in a spring over setup, but that's usually just using like a flatter leaf spring, which once again has its drawbacks. So for an everyday suspension, my choice is a spring under. For more of a hardcore crawler or a rig that's going to see or need that extra articulation, definitely spring over leaps and bounds. So I hope this has helped you guys out some a little bit. Talking about it will often help me work through situations myself. So once again, I hope this has helped you guys maybe make a decision a little bit easier. Spring over, double the cost. Spring under, double the stability, in my opinion. Thanks so much for stopping by. Please comment, like, subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one, guys.